This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Come on, we all know the information age, a phone in our hand attached to our hip, it's dumbing us down. We got too much crap coming at us from every direction. Literally every direction, every feeling, every synapse is being stimulated at all times. Why is it being stimulated? Who benefits from the stimulation? My guest today, Charles Chaffin, has a lot of great ideas, research, and insights about this very topic. His new book, Numb, How the Information Age Dulls Our Senses and How We Can Get Them Back. Now, as a side tangent, I'm not so sure we can get them back. I think we're a part of the matrix already. But Charles is the optimist. He thinks we can get it back. And damn it, I want to be optimistic too. It's just going to be a long, slow, rough ride. But I give him a lot of credit because he realizes, and his work shows this, we are being distracted. Distracted in all kinds of ways. Distractions that primarily benefit certain groups that are making money off your distraction. So take Charles' wisdom to heart, turn off some of the distractions, let a few of the tech billionaires not make as much money, and get a little bit of your life back. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Charles Chaffin and talk about this unfortunate topic of how the information age is dulling us and perhaps even dumbing us down. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Wow, Charles, you have found yourself into the topic area that we all know deep down inside of us is not such a good thing, but we just keep doing it every day. We're kind of like addicts, aren't we?
We are like addicts. The analogy is always to tobacco and nicotine. This is true, although I think it's a little bit bigger because it's our attention, which is everything to everything that we do.
So you're saying it's more like heroin?
It's from
Not
what
that
I've
I
read,
have any experience with heroin. I know you don't either. Okay, we're just two guys talking.
Yeah, we're not in the church basement here. There's no meeting going on here, right?
So many disclaimers needed in this world. Look, it's so crazy too, is it? And we're going to get into this, that I think one of the reasons that we are all so circumspect about what we might say is we're all afraid of the mob coming after us or being canceled or this or that. And it used to be if two people wanted to have a conversation, they happened to have disagreements, they could still have a beer. But all this technology is making that go away, isn't it?
It has, for a lot of reasons. We're primed and ready to fire up the outrage machine. But given the fact that the way we consume information, the way we search for information that confirms our beliefs, we're not spending a lot of time with people who look at things differently than us. When we do, our feathers get a little ruffled, don't they?
It's really tricky. I mean, I like to think I've got a certain view on things, and I like to think I have a good filter, and I can see when people are coming at me with misinformation. And I like to think that I've got a little more experience than some folks at it, but I'm still sure there's some biases deep inside me that I like to imagine are not there.
Yeah, and we all have them too. When those biases become so much part of our identity, those heels start to get dug in even more, and we start becoming part of that tribe, if you will. We have the social media piece. When we get into some of these filter bubbles, it just gets worse and worse and worse as we go.
I didn't say it at the beginning, and maybe you already know this, and it's not really part of the conversation but in the sense that for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been outside of the States. So I've had a chance to observe it. I think it's a little bit different when you get to observe what's happened in the last 7 or 8 years, especially even the last 5 years. This whole topic area we're going to jump into today with you is there's an acceleration going on, isn't there? I mean, we can all feel it. There's something accelerating, and it's not accelerating to something that feels good.
It's definitely getting worse. When it comes to things like confirmation bias, it's not just so much that we certainly do look for information that confirms our beliefs or that we identify with it, but then we continually search for it. And there's an element, I'm not going to beat up capitalism here, but there's an element of outlets wanting to maximize their dollar, maximize ratings, keep attention focused on their platforms. And so they're going to serve the people what they want. Algorithms are going to serve the people what they've consumed, which just tears us apart even further. And again, those heels just keep getting dug in as every day you're told, you're right.
Well, let's start with where you just went, which is attention and ad dollars and eyeballs. I saw a graphic the other day. It compared Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. If I get these percentages wrong, someone can correct me, but I believe 95% of Facebook's revenue comes from attention ads. I think Google is at like 60 to 70%, Amazon like 30%, Apple at 0% because Apple is selling hardware essentially. So they're not monetizing the attention. Somebody might already say, well, we can't just pick on Facebook. We just can't just exclude Apple. But I think Facebook's probably an interesting enough place to start. I mean, Facebook is Instagram and WhatsApp. Those are the three big operations Facebook runs. And look, it's a great service in the sense that we've all probably used it. I use it every day. So I have to thank Mr. Zuck for giving me this nice free service. But a lot of people probably don't understand how Facebook makes money. Fair enough?
Very fair. I would probably offer a friendly amendment that you're not paying Facebook with dollars, but you're paying Facebook with your attention. We live in an attention economy now. It is about getting the attention of the consumer through a variety of means, and then the wallet will follow. But we are in an attention economy.
I mean, I don't necessarily think if everyone understands what Mark Zuckerberg is offering and he offers it, and then we all use it, I mean, ultimately, don't we have to take some culpability there?
Absolutely. There's going to be a lot of decisions regarding what these platforms are going to be like in the next several years as Congress considers what's going to happen with these platforms. Are they a publisher or are they a platform? For the last, 25 years, they've had the luxury of basically saying, well, you know what? We're just a platform. We're not responsible for the content that's on this platform. Well, both sides of the aisle now here in Washington have an issue with that for different reasons. But are they responsible for some of this content? It's in the news now. It's in the news almost every day. And now the internet has grown in the way that it has. That's an outdated law. There's an element there of policy, which I talk about in the book about where we're going to go and that it is going to change in some way, shape, or form. We don't necessarily know how, but Internet 2.0 will look differently. Whether we are paying, there's no way that these platforms are going to be able to go ahead and look at every piece of content that comes on, verify it. That's not going to happen. I mean, if you're sitting and watching the Academy Awards and you post something to your friends about it, you don't want it to take 2 weeks to get verified that what you said was true. It's too late. The moment's over. It's going to change. We just don't know how it's going to change. But yeah, with regarding our culpabilities, you mentioned, there is some of that, although I would argue these fake rewards and elements of attention panhandling and the dopamine loop has pulled us in. I'm not going to say that we're necessarily victims there. However, these devices and these platforms are designed to steal your attention. They are designed to basically make the user the product to marketers.
Yeah, well, back to the heroin aspect in the sense that the dopamine hits, that's what you're talking about in that sense. And they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. In regards to platform versus publisher, you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but I saw the other day, and I've seen it actually several times, that I've made a Facebook post in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and perhaps the keyword that I used in that post was either vaccine or COVID. I noticed that right when I posted it, there'd be a warning that came from Facebook that said, I'm paraphrasing, this is not being published immediately, this will be reviewed. It seems like I would see that message and then it would get live almost immediately. But I was still seeing this message. So I was thinking to myself, well, if they're censoring me, doesn't that make them a publisher?
Yeah, they've had the best of both worlds here. And certainly the same issue comes with Donald Trump's accounts and all of those different things. They have had the luxury to say, oh, for years, we're going to curate content that is pornographic in nature or that could cause harm to others. However, we're not going to verify facts. Well, wait a minute. Again, it goes back to that gray area. Which are you? If you're a platform, you're not curating and evaluating anything. You're just providing the platform, no matter how horrible it is that people might post, you're just posting it. Look at Twitter. At the other side, if you're a publisher, then you're no different than a media outlet. There's some element of responsibility there. So they've ridden this gray area. I would offer, and it's outside of my area of expertise, but I felt like it had to be addressed in the book. Now that we're into this new election cycle and the Democrats are in control, they've taken a little bit more of a stance in being a little bit more aggressive when it comes to facts. The other side of the aisle says that it's quelching free speech and whatnot. They're writing this gray area. It's impossible to see that that's going to last forever.
As somebody who put his first website up in 1996 and then watched the development of Facebook, I had one simple conclusion when I saw Facebook. I was like, okay, this is for people that did not want to do what I did, which is own a server, develop web pages, and all this other kind of stuff. And Facebook basically made it easy. They basically made the internet easy. I almost wonder why they don't just stay at that approach. I guess every ill and every evil that you might see on the internet would all of a sudden be on a platform that one man controls. And I guess that really wouldn't be a nice feeling if all of a sudden you saw all kinds of stuff that you don't want to see on something that you own and control. It is a hairy situation. I look at it from us as the individual. You can look at it from the government standpoint. You can look at it from Mark Zuckerberg's standpoint. It's a hairy issue, isn't it?
It's an incredibly hairy issue. And added to all the things that you mentioned, on the individual side, this idea of stealing attention. And when someone goes onto Facebook, they have 1,000 friends. They know 100 of them. The other 900, they've just friended for whatever reason. They start to have this element of FOMO where they're comparing their lives to the curated lives that people are posting online. They start to say, well, wait a minute. Johnny's posting these things all the time. He's always on vacation. I don't get that. My life is missing. They don't know Johnny. Well, Johnny's a mess, but he's curating.
Johnny's actually on heroin, but we don't know that.
Johnny is all heroin all the time, but he's not posting about it. There's these false comparisons, and it's almost like the opposite. We talk about choice architecture, right? Where we start to limit choices so that individuals can take informed actions. It's almost the opposite of that in a sense that we start to question our past choices. We start questioning our relationships and our work, our fitness regimen, all those different things. So we're talking about tribalism and whatnot on a grand scale, but on the individual level, we're seeing the fear of missing out. There's elements of loneliness because, again, we're back into this operant conditioning, this dopamine. We're in that loop. If you're doing that for 1, 2, 3 hours a day, that comes at the expense of authentic relationships and authentic experiences, which creates, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but loneliness.
I'll give you, just kind of as a foundation for this conversation to unfold, just a perspective where I'm coming from. As I say, I started a website in 1996, continuous since 1996. And, on my website, eventually I moved to having a chat board. It was called Discuss or something. And I remember the pivot where the discussions that were on my website pivoted and went to Facebook. For me, I've always just looked at these platforms as an extension of my business and the way that I communicate. I don't necessarily check out what most people are doing. I'll go and I use Facebook or Twitter, kind of like the blog that I've been using for 20 years, as a way to disseminate information. This is kind of what I do for my career. That's been my way that I do it. I think that's probably different than most people. And I think I have to take a step back and learn from someone like yourself that I think a lot of people really, if you're not using these tools for business, if you're not even thinking about customers, and it's all just some ego gratification, then if we start to divide this up into generations, right? There's no way we can compare a 13-year-old girl today to my 80-year-old mother. There's no comparison. My mom's not using these tools. She'll use her iPhone, but the 13-year-old girl is going to have a tremendously different life.
Absolutely. And especially with a 13-year-old girl, and in that generation, elements of self-esteem and getting back to these ideas of false comparisons and whatnot. There are I don't want to sit here and say all the things on the individual level with social media are bad. They're not. It's sociology. They talk about this number of 150. It's called Dunbar's number. 150 people is what we have a capacity to have relationships with. If you're on Facebook, for example, and you've got 120 friends and you know all of them, everybody from folks you went to high school with to your family, and you're using those platforms to strengthen existing relationships, connect with family who's far away, to offer comments on things or share pictures or whatnot. Research suggests that's a pretty good thing to do. That's okay. You're not doing the attention panhandling that I like to call, or trying to post things to get more likes, or getting into these filter bubbles. You try to become more extreme to get more attention, which is an element of attention panhandling too, right? I'm going to say something even more outrageous, or I'm going to make an even more outrageous charge that brings more likes and comments. So if you're using it to really strengthen your network, it can be a really good thing. But it's when you start getting into the sea of lots of other people and you're using it to substitute for something a little bit more authentic, I think that's when we start to run into some problems.
And if I take this out, our conversation so far, if I take it out even bigger picture, regardless of the things that we've talked about so far, I love this overriding phraseology that you use, which is the dulling of our senses. Is that even if these things are good or bad, ultimately, we all have to acknowledge that we're being dulled, and I almost want to use the word dumbed too, but we're being dulled down for sure. I mean, we are losing something. We're losing, how would you describe what we're losing exactly? We could probably talk for days and weeks and months about what we're losing, but we're losing, ultimately, I think, this human connection. Even if we go with the idea that Facebook can bring families and stuff together. But then what happens if we use these tools too much? They become a substitute for the real thing, right?
I think that's right. I was really interested in compassion fatigue. Like, I started thinking about seeing graphic suffering all the time. And I started to wonder how that impacts my compassion for the people around me that really need it.
You were seeing it personally through technology, and basically you as an individual were feeling pain and sorrow from other individuals, and you want to give back, but eventually there's only one of you, you've only got so much money, you've only got so much time, and you can only give so much back, and when you reach that wall, that's compassion fatigue.
Absolutely. It's a phrase that comes from the medical profession, and actually journalism has it too. I write about a physician that suffered from it during the AIDS crisis, just the idea of suffering from every day having patients in the late 80s and early 90s when folks weren't living very long and not being able to do anything about it, how that weighed on him. As the book expanded, to your point, it really is about authenticity. That's the issue here. Authentic relationships, authenticity when it comes to what's real and what's not. As I went along, the second theme came about, and that was where we're going right now. Technology and the information age is no longer a tool to help us get to that authenticity. It has become a destination in and of itself. That social media has become the place, not the place to lead us to more in-person relationships. I talk about Tinder. The dating apps now too have become the place not to lead us to something better, but they've become the destination, which is really scary and in some cases pretty sad.
I've never used a dating app. Clarification. I think 10 years ago when I was in California, I went on a date with a lady off Match.com, and she thought she was being really interesting and set us up to go to some kind of panel or group discussion at some coffee house. And we went there, and it was a bunch of lunatic 9/11 conspiracy theory folks, and she was mortified. But my point being is I've never used Tinder. However, I do, on the front lines of things, having talked to a lot of males that use Tinder, my understanding of Tinder and how guys use Tinder, at least at this moment in time, and maybe there's some out there using it a different way, but it's just a tool that scares the bejesus out of me, because I just can't imagine that in the long run, a tool that perhaps is just being used as a quick way to hook up. Boy, this is not good for anything on the outside world, so to speak. This is really I don't know what it's turning us into. What's it turning us into?
I think that it turns us into this idea. So if you go meet a woman on Tinder, you have been on Tinder every day for the past 3 months. We're doing like 1 billion swipes a day or something like that on Tinder. You're swiping away for 3 months. And then you meet this individual. It is her versus the Tinder field. It gets into this element of choice.
Too much choice.
There's too much choice. Yeah, exactly. You see one maybe imperfection. It might not even be an imperfection. It might just be
a picture,
something
just
that's
a picture.
Just right, right. And you're comparing that to pictures, per your point, on Tinder that are so incredibly curated. If I write in the book about the best way, research shows how the best way to take selfies are for men and for women and whatnot. Again, you're comparing against not only an ideal group on Tinder, but you might be comparing against something that's completely fictional. Then folks, they're on Tinder for a long, long time. And I'm not suggesting that some people haven't been successful with it, but by and large, it is a huge cycle that people get into because they're comparing the people that they actually meet to this ideal or to the field, if you will.
So I do happen to be, look, everyone's going to have their perspective and their direction. I happen to be a straight male. I happen to do yoga a lot. So I've got a lot of yoga teachers that are ladies. I happen to be in Southeast Asia. Here's something that's really interesting that I think a lot of guys that have gotten stuck in these cycles with these tools might not understand. I've got yoga teachers who, by any measure of, wow, that is a beautiful woman inside and out, and you meet her in person and you're like, wow, she's a beautiful woman inside and out. Then you might see her social media stuff where she's just one of these people that doesn't really care. Maybe she doesn't look like a supermodel online, but offline in the real world, she looks like a supermodel. So imagine how many, for the straight guys out there, the lonely guys out there that are looking for a lady, imagine how many of them are using Tinder and thinking, well, that girl's not pretty enough. But in person, she could be stunning and you're just completely zeroing her out because she doesn't fit the ideal or the fake ideal that you just described that could have a lot of Photoshop involved.
That's exactly right. It's a real world versus this ideal. And again, it doesn't get them anywhere because they are thinking about this notion of perfection and they become dulled with it. There are lots of research from, especially people that are in behaviorists from back in the day that say that we're just overwhelmed with choice. We should have choices made for us. And that's very controversial on a lot of fronts.
I could do it. Look, for eating, I could do it for the rest of my life. If somebody actually knew what they were talking about and they said, Mike, eat this every meal, I would do it.
Yeah, there is a lot of truth to what those folks wrote about 30, 40, 50 years ago. This idea that some choices, if they were made for us, we would be far better off. We get into choice, basically two ideas. There's folks who are what called satisficers. Satisficers are people who basically say, all right, this is what I need. This is what I'm spending. And I'm not talking about Tinder. They're going to go buy a dishwasher, right? For example, this is what I need. This is what I'm willing to spend. And when they go see it, they buy it. Whereas other people are maximizers. So maximizers, they want to look at every possible option. They want to get every piece of information they can. And then ultimately, they'll make a decision. Well, now
they've wasted a lot of time.
They've wasted a lot of time, given in this information age. They could be looking at multiple sites. And what tends to happen, by the way, with the maximizers, after they make that choice, they tend to have more regret afterwards. Oh, I should have picked option 3 instead of option 5 and whatnot. So it is a waste of a lot of time and people become overwhelmed with it.
I was just thinking back to my food example, letting somebody else pick for me. I mean, a lot of people on this planet grow up with a mother who perhaps makes a dinner for them. And guess what? Generally, I don't recall. I mean, maybe sometimes my mother would say to me, hey, what would you guys like? But most of the time, you really didn't have a choice. You were eating what was put in front of you, you know?
I lived the same way. There was no conversation about, so what's on the menu tonight? No. We found out what was on the menu when it hit the table.
Exactly. Let's take it into, since you happen to be in Washington, D.C., and I don't know if we're going to find any controversy and where I want to take it, but I think it's something, if we look at, I guess this would be what I would call the third controversial, well, I was going to try to say we're on the third controversial president, Biden, Trump, Obama. But then I was thinking, well, hold on. No, George Bush Jr. was pretty much controversial. Bill Clinton was pretty controversial. George Bush Sr. was pretty controversial. Reagan was pretty controversial. Carter was controversial. Nixon was controversial. LBJ was controversial. JFK was controversial. Eisenhower might have been sort of milquetoast. I mean, how far do we have to go back? But here's where I'm going ultimately is news. I think it's for those people that can somewhat check their bias and somewhat check their ego. It's pretty clear to see right now in modern America that there are two competing forces in the news media. One force is putting a liberal view out and one force is putting a conservative view out. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a very fair assessment. I would throw into that mix, going back to that use of algorithms and social media, right? Serving us, including YouTube in that, which is a huge component of all of this. But absolutely, we are serving people what they want or what they've consumed, or we're giving them the option when it comes to news outlets and cable news and whatnot to where their bias goes. So absolutely.
Here's the thing that I expect to happen, which will probably even further the silo process. I don't think I'm out of turn and everyone can do their own searches and find this out if they don't know, but the current gatekeepers of the large tech companies, what do they call it, the FANGs or whatnot? I mean, Apple, Facebook, Google, Twitter, these folks all are very distinctly to the left. I would expect in the future that there will be mirror images of all the social media platforms now, but to the right. And then these silos will probably disconnect, maybe. Will that be the moment we have a balkanized country when the silos disconnect? Could you imagine that would happen?
Why wouldn't it happen? Because there's a market for it. No different than there's a market when it comes to cable news for different outlets. And you're even seeing, even within that they become further and further to the right or further and further to the left as news may come in that is contradictory to what the tribe wants. There's no reason to think that that won't happen because there's a market for it.
What is your thought process? I just laid out a scenario where I can imagine us getting farther and farther to the polls, and you confirm that. I think one of the things that I have seen, or I think a lot of people would agree with this occurs on both sides of the aisle, is what I would call just made up stuff. People are just making up stuff. I mean, it almost seems like we've reached the point in America that perhaps we should stop pretending that news, again, whatever side, is news, and just realize it's either an opinion or a preferred choice of a preferred topic to go in a certain direction. Meaning there's not just this Walter Cronkite, here's the big story stuff anymore. That doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't. Part of it is going back to those days when Walter Cronkite was the anchor. The major networks basically dumped a lot of money into their news divisions because they felt like the more money they put in there, the more that actually this town, Washington, D.C., would stay off their back from a regulatory perspective. So they were okay taking a loss in a news division. So they would fund it well. And it wasn't about ratings. It was more about keeping regulation off of their backs. And then when we got into the 80s, when the big three were bought off into corporations, they became for-profit entities. And obviously with cable news coming really into its own around 2000 and whatnot, then you started to see this more sensationalism and you started to see more opinion and more bias and whatnot. I think as far as where it goes right now, it's difficult to see a scenario where we're all going to come together or where these outlets are going to write opinion underneath the face of the talking head so that folks could separate out what's fact from what's opinion. That seems very difficult to ascertain. And in a lot of cases, it isn't so much about, people always say, well, you should have a balanced diet. You should watch a little bit of the left and you should watch a little bit of the right and whatnot. In a lot of cases, the best approach to this is actually transparency. How transparent is the source that you have? And that's better than saying, okay, I'm going to spend a little time on this opinion, a little time on that opinion. Everyone seems to say they do that they listen to both sides, right? I've never met anyone that says, no, I only listen to one and I don't care about anything else. Everyone always wants to say, well, I'm hearing both sides and I've decided that this theory makes the most sense. But transparency is a really key component to how we developed our news diet, if you will. And unfortunately, I don't see a scenario where regulation is going to step in and say that you have to listen to both sides of an argument or bring in guests from the left and the right. I don't see that scenario because it's about attention and it's about eyeballs.
I'll give you an example. I'm sure some people will try to slot me with what I'm about to say, but I have done the exercise of going to Wikipedia and looking up the Fox News entry and looking up the CNN entry. And the Fox News entry says, Fox News, conservative, right-leaning. And the CNN entry does not. That's unfortunate. I really think that we would be much better off if all of the particular platforms, and I'm getting at the word transparency, if all of the particular platforms that have their particular persuasion or their particular bias would just state it. As an observer of news, there is absolutely, and I've got plenty of conservative friends and plenty of liberal friends, nobody objectively can say that CNN is anything but a liberal news outlet, and nobody objectively can say that Fox News is anything but a conservative news outlet. If we start to at least go down that path, we're much better off. It's like, look in Washington, D.C., do you still have the Washington Times? I mean, everyone knows the Washington Post is liberal and everyone knows the Washington Times is conservative, right?
Yeah. The problem with that, of course, from the platform's perspective is that level of transparency for some people would be, well, then it's not the news. They do see if somebody's consuming something on the far right or far left, they see it as the fact. This is factual. There were people during all of the drama with the last administration that had no idea that there was any type of impeachment. They were watching Fox News. They didn't even know that it existed. They said, this is the news. There's no impeachment. I don't know anything about it. They interview these people and they know nothing about it. That labeling or whatnot eliminates this idea that we are the source. We are the only ones. We're the gatekeepers of facts and whatnot.
It's definitely what they're doing. I'm just saying it's the transparency part. I mean, again, there's a whole effort. For example, if Wikipedia is the one that's allowing that, there's a whole effort that allows that. This starts to be, again, I just think we'd be much better off. I love the word transparency. Let me flip it into something a little dicier than even news, pornography. I remember being a preteen or something and all the guys in the neighborhood, I guess I'm dating myself to some degree, but there was like some barn, everybody was finding, Penthouse and Playboys and stuff. Pornography's been around for a long time in one form or another. It's not exactly new. However, that at least took effort when we were 12 years old. It took a lot of effort to find something, right? But today, was a guy who's got 2 nephews, one's 17, junior in high school. And I haven't asked him exactly what he's seen on the internet, but I have to imagine he's seen everything. And I can't imagine that for his own personal development, it's a good thing that he's seen everything. I can't imagine that that's been good for him. I'm on the Larry Flynt side in many ways. I think Larry Flynt was one of the best First Amendment guys. Some of those arguments were fantastic, and he took it to the man. It's still, where do you find that line? And how do you protect people that perhaps don't know how to protect themselves? It's messy as hell. And then again, getting back to your word dull, if this stuff is coming at everybody 24/7 like a fire hose to the mouth, what happens to your brain if you're a young guy? What happens to your brain if you see naked women all day long? What happens to you?
Yeah. In behavior, we talk about the notion of friction. In the days when you were looking at Penthouse in the barn or whatever, there was an element of friction there. Or when you went into a video store, and I'm not suggesting you did this, but when some would go into some sort of video store and rent pornography.
I don't own a trench coat, so...
or a hat to pull over your eyes. There was an element of friction there. You might see your boss in there, right? Or you might see somebody you know. You might not go as often as you would like. Well, now with the internet, you have access to it all the time. And Pornhub is the only one that's really released data. And their earnings, the major networks, we're talking about the major networks, they would kill for the revenue that Pornhub's bringing in.
That's mostly males, right? Of course, right?
It's mostly males, yeah.
What do you think it's at, 95% male?
I don't think it's that high. I think it's like around 70%. I think the last data that I saw was around 70% male. I think one of the interesting factoids about Pornhub data, there are 2 days of the year where pornography consumption is the least. You want to take a guess at what those 2 days of the year are?
I have no idea. Mother's Day and Christmas. I don't know.
You're close. One is New Year's Eve and one is Super Bowl Sunday. It actually, the time of day that there's more pornography consumption reaches its peak between 3 and 4 in the afternoon when the kids are coming home from school before the parents get there, and then later at night. And in some cases, maybe when one partner has gone to bed. I asked this very question. I wanted to know, and I interviewed a lot of people on the pornography side. Basically, this question, is pornography good or bad? A lot of folks working in some element of psychology basically said that if you are in a relationship, a committed relationship, now it goes back to our word transparency. If there's transparency about porn consumption, it's not a bad thing. And I'm painting with a broad brush here, of course, but if it's a secret, if that consumption is secret on one partner or the other, then it could lead to some problems. For folks that are single, that was kind of the notion. The idea was that people who are consuming pornography are less likely to get into committed relationships. There were fears actually about sexual violence many years ago if it was easier access to pornography. And actually, much of the research looking at it at a macro level was that folks were still interested in being a committed relationship, even if they were consuming pornography, that it wasn't as much of an issue. So the book doesn't give a hard and fast answer whether porn is good or bad. There's lots of asterisks to it. At least on the couple side, it's really about transparency.
But it's surely, I mean, you would not put it in your work if it wasn't, but there is some aspect where it has to dull us in some way. If we're being bombarded by these types, if somebody's consuming porn images nonstop, they are going to have, most likely on some kind of macro level, if we're looking at it from a macro level, if the porn consumption's at certain levels, they're going to behave differently. They're going to think differently. I'm not necessarily saying they're going to be like some terrible person. Some could be, but it's just changing us. It's changing us to something. Is that a good thing or not? I mean, you say you don't take a stab at it. It's worth considering that what happens, this gets to Instagram too. Bring in Instagram. I mean, Instagram is basically pornography with the bathing suit still on. I mean, what's the difference? At least in terms of the way that I see, I don't know what guys are doing. I mean, occasionally I've seen some women posting on it. I don't do much on Instagram, but it sure looks like that when women post on Instagram, it's sexy, sexy stuff.
One could make the argument that Instagram is worse when you bring in the self-esteem component.
Comparison, your neighbor, your friend, whoever.
Absolutely. Body image and all of those different things. I think going back to your point about pornography, there's an element of instant gratification. And I talk extensively about general terms about instant gratification. That, yeah, when we get that dopamine hit, it does rewire the pathways in our brain that we want that again and again and again. It does change us. At the 30,000 foot level, some could say, well, why should I bother going to connect with somebody at an event or a bar or whatnot? I could just stay home and watch pornography, But when it comes to things like Instagram, and folks are panhandling for attention, their self-worth in so many cases, and not everyone. I want to be clear about that. But a lot of people are seeing their self-worth from the perspective of how many likes and comments that they get, even from the perspective of adjusting their life experiences so that they can achieve these likes. I'm going to go on this vacation, and I know if I post this picture here, I'm going to get lots of likes, when they may not even want to go on that vacation, but they want that attention panhandling again. And that's very problematic when it comes to substitution.
Speak to the generations on that must be much heavier desire to do something like that, to actually go on a trip to get likes. I would say that's going to be much more likely for a person that is 24 versus a person that's 74.
Absolutely. So as individuals get older, it tends not to alter their behavior as much to get those likes. Now, it's not everyone. There's still segments.
Let me stop you for a second, though. But here's the issue, though, is I'm a guy, it's half my life pre-internet, half my life post-internet. The person that's 74 today might not be interested in going on a vacation to get likes. But what about the person that's 24 today when they're 74 after 50 years of it? Are they going to be so rewired that even at age 74, the 24-year-old today is going to go take a vacation because they're still on crack or heroin to get those likes?
Well, I hope that they read this book.
You've got a problem, though, in the sense that right here, you want to have this conversation. And in many ways, it's more information for people, right? It's more information to even digest.
I started the book by saying, I wrote this book because we have too much information to read. Absolutely. That's absolutely right. But I hope, going back to the 24-year-old in 50 years, I hope that at some point, and at some point soon, that they will reflect on the ROI, the return on investment of all the time and attention that they have put on social media and realize it's not working. I'm not as connected to other people. I'm lonelier. I'm not happier. This just isn't working for me. Or even if it's not that dramatic, it is, and instead of investing an hour a day on this or getting into a habit of going to it when I'm in line at a coffee shop or whatever, I'm going to delete it, or I'm only going to look at it a couple times a week, or I'm only going to connect with people who I know that I want to have stronger relationships. I really hope that folks can reflect and say, is this working for me or is it not? And I think a lot of folks would realize it's just not.
I don't know if this is controversial or not. I don't think it's controversial at all in my mind. Has anybody done the research to connect tech usage with American obesity?
There's a study out of University of Pennsylvania that looked, there were 7 different factors, and obesity was one of them, and internet use. For those individuals that had a high level body mass index, I guess, was the variable there. For high internet usage, there was, over the course of 3 years in that study, there was an increase in BMI for a lot of those folks.
We've got a BMI increase basically over everyone in America. And if I take away the controversial or take away the word obesity and just say, okay, we've got a BMI increase of everybody to some level, it sure looks like that if tech took off starting in, let's say, 1995, it sure looks like we've had 25 years. It's really hard. I try it many times walking in Saigon traffic. I try to walk, text and stuff and not get hit by a car. But I think for most people, it's probably very difficult to use their technology when they're moving.
Absolutely. And taking this to a 30,000 foot level, our attention is a zero-sum game. We only have so much of it. All of this information and all of this technology we have, we're creating more content in a year, in most cases, than we've ever created in the history of man before that combined. But yet the brains that we have, they haven't been really redesigned for 10,000 years. They're still hunting and mating apparatus. If we're focused our attention on tech or on social media, that comes at the expense of something else. In the book, I talk about relationships. I would say fitness, per your point about obesity and BMI, but it comes at the expense of something. In many cases, we see people on devices 3, 4, 5 hours a day. Well, that means they're not doing or not thinking about a lot of other things because they're on that.
Some guy told me recently that one of his male friends was on Tinder 6 to 8 hours a day. I've never used Tinder, but I thought to myself, holy, what in the blazes? Where's your life? Like, all you have to do is probably walk out and go to a coffee shop and actually see a real physical person versus who knows what real or fake photos on Tinder. You've got some solutions and you're welcome to throw a few out. I think for me personally, I just think we're a long way away from solutions. I think this baby has got to ride its way out and get even crazier and crazier and crazier. Perhaps get to Mike Judge's Idiocracy movie before we actually see a meltdown.
At the risk of oversimplifying, it really is about managing technology and this information without it managing us. I cite research even when, so many of us put our phones down, put them face down in front of us at a meeting or at dinner. That even takes cognitive energy, even if it's off, just being in the presence of them. So how can we put them in our bags or put them in another room and have dedicated time? I'm going to spend this next 30 minutes or 45 minutes solely on this project or with someone closest to us at dinner. We're not going to, the term phubbing, we're not going to pick up our phone and start texting and whatnot. I think the realization that the best thing that we can give to another person is our attention, our undivided attention and being present with them. And that applies to our work and whatnot. The opportunity costs that come from all of this constant picking up our phone and being distracted over the course of time, many, many studies that say that, if we're solely focused on something and we're distracted, it can take upwards of 20 minutes to get back to that level of focus that we had before we were distracted. That happens 2 or 3 times. That's an incredible price that we're paying in our work or with those closest to us. How we can manage that technology, not having Outlook open all day for every notification when we're in a workplace, and really having that time to focus on what's important to us is really the first step. I hope that people will reflect. I don't offer to say technology is good, technology is bad, or that you should do this, you should do that. What I hope the reader gets out of this is that they start to reflect and say, okay, this is working for me, but this isn't. And here's some strategies. Talking to a lot of therapists, here's some strategies that's going to help make it work for them.
So here's the tricky part, getting back to the word we used at the beginning of the conversation. If this stuff is like heroin, then the idea of having some heuristic we can operate with to turn things off or whatnot, I just don't know if that's possible for most people. There's no evidence it's possible so far, right? Is there anything in any kind of macro data that says any of these devices or any of these apps that there's any slowdown in usage? Is there any speed bump that you can see? I know you're motivated to say that we can find ways to slow it down, but is there anything you see that's slowing any usage down?
I think that the analogy to cigarettes and nicotine is very apt. There's certainly people who have quit smoking. My father quit smoking and still dealt with it for years after, even when he didn't quit. The urges were there and whatnot. But to your point, these things are designed for addiction. They absolutely are. And they require a level of vigilance that is incredibly strong. There isn't macro data that suggests that segments of the population are called dopamine fasting, whatnot. I don't think that's a realistic option. We're just going to go into this oasis where we're not engaging technology.
Even though you spend all this effort to point out to us, to get us thinking, to get us reflecting, there has to be a side of you that says, maybe I can make zero dent, because ultimately this is a horse out of the barn running so fast. You're going to get some people to reflect. It's a beast to overcome, isn't it?
It's a huge beast to overcome. You're absolutely right. So the optimist in me says that people were smart and people are going to start to realize, I'm not getting anywhere with this. This is not making my life better. I'm not happier. I'm not closer to people. I'm not productive as I used to be. I need to change this. And I don't need to necessarily delete everything. I need to manage it. I need to cut back on this. I don't want to suggest that this isn't a huge problem. It is an immense problem. Maybe the biggest problem we have right now. We are distracted. I hope that folks look at this work and say, I can use this to my advantage, but it's not designed to be my friend. These touchy-feely ads that the platforms have, right, where people are hugging and coming together. No. These things are designed to steal your attention. And in some cases, I would argue that's the most important thing that we have.
Well, it's interesting too, in those two words, distracted and attention, in many ways, and for many people, they don't feel like they're distracted at all. Where they're giving their attention, this is the most important thing to them. And maybe there is nothing else for them. Maybe the way their life has unfolded and their brains have been wired to do something else would be distracting. And this is where they give their attention because this is their life. It's a mess. It's a mess.
I mean, it's a chicken or egg to your point, right?
Yeah.
For people to say, well, they have nothing else, so they're on this. Well, that's one of the reasons why they may not have anything else. Just join your local gym, even if you don't want to work out, and talk to another human being.
Yeah, see people.
Right.
I think it's even more than see people. I'm a yoga nut, so I'm doing yoga all the time. But there is something that when you're doing something, again, it could be anything. I'm just talking about yoga because I do it. But when you're doing it and you're doing it with somebody else and there's a little bit of competition going on and a little bit of drive, sweat, getting back to the Eastern philosophers, your brain turns off and you go kind of zen and you get into maybe a little bit of a flow state. And if you can find some flow state, then you're bypassing all the things that you're talking about, right? That's why I do yoga.
Absolutely. And that flow is critical. And also being part of something that is bigger than yourself is critical. And one thing that we didn't talk about here that I think is also important when we think about especially things like compassion fatigue or the outrage machine and all these types of byproducts that come from the information age. And in a lot of cases, taking the other side of this, where people feel overwhelmed by bad news. They hear bad news stories, have their 15 minutes of fame, and then we move on to something else. There's an element of helplessness in some cases that people feel because they're sitting there and they're subjecting themselves to this all the time. If folks can find one thing, one cause, one effort to focus their energy, that's going to make it different. They don't have to try to address all of the ills. That's impossible. But find one cause, whether it's working in a homeless shelter or helping the local humane society or tutoring a child, but find one thing to focus their energy. It's going to address this helplessness and maybe make people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, which is rewarding for them and for whoever they're helping.
But on the flip side, though, too, as you mentioned compassion fatigue, again, I was going to bring this up earlier. Okay, if you find the one thing, then that's great. But the real issue is how do you put at bay the onslaught of things? And I'll tell you the way that I do it. If you're going to have compassion, I'd rather that be offline for me. But the way I look at it, the way that my hack, my heuristic around it is you come at me, not you, but anybody comes at me with a request for online compassion or some type of, I'm just immune to it. It just doesn't stop online. So you got to pick your poison. Where and who do you want to give compassion to? But I find it's too easy to ask for compassion online. I mean, I see sometimes people Facebook post or something and it's just not real. Maybe there's something real behind it, but for me, I find the easiest thing is just, I don't even see it. It's just past me. For many of the issues that you and I have talked about today, that's almost the way you have to do it. You almost just have to say, I don't see it. It's not there.
You don't have to sit and watch it for an hour or 2 or 3 hours a day. You don't have to subject yourself to all of that information and drama and suffering and whatnot. It goes back to this theme of how we can manage it. You've got to turn it off. Even if the world's coming to an end, even if things are as horrible as they possibly could be, that doesn't mean you can't go in and bake a cake. It doesn't mean you can't do something else to try to just disconnect from it and whatnot. You've got to manage it. There's a dopamine hit when we see the term breaking news. When we come back, we're going to tell you if the world's going to end in 10 minutes. Oh, I better stay on. That doesn't sound good. You come back and it's going to be cloudy.
I would say the breaking news thing, let's see if we're reading each other's mind. The point that started, that caused everybody to want to watch incessantly, has to go back to 9/11, at least for Americans. When 9/11 hit, if one was alive or old enough or whatever, man, that breaking news thing, the way that unfolded, that was just seared into us. And so here we are 20 years later, and it's like breaking news for somebody ate a hot dog, and that's breaking news. Hot dog eating contest on the 4th of July, breaking news. I mean, really, it's got into that. And we still all watch because we've been conditioned, right?
I think it's been around that time for not only for the event of 9/11, but for what we talked about earlier in terms of the changing landscape of the news and the for-profit entity that came from that. Our brains are designed to detect potential threats. When breaking news comes up, we get that hit thinking, oh, this is a threat. We need to find out what it is. We're going to stay on that and stay tuned. And Jon Stewart made a great comment many years ago. He said the cable news is designed only for 9/11. So something like 9/11, they have enough reasonable content to be in existence. But any other time, we got to fill some time and we got to create not only some opinion and address the tribe like we talked about, but we also got to, in some cases, scare the hell out of people as much as we can so they'll stay tuned.
I think when people see the breaking news headline, they should perhaps imagine who is in charge of that chyron, that lower third. And they should probably be thinking about there's some 24-year-old dude sitting in some control room, typing on a computer who really doesn't know anything. That's just his gig, his job. And someone's telling him what to write. It's just completely either formulaic or just gearing up the audience or whatever, but we should really think about, where does that chyron come from? Where do those words come from? Who typed those words? Who is that person? If you start to break it down like that, then you can realize you're being played.
It's looking at it through a critical eye, even the source that maybe speaks to our tribe, looking at it a critical eye and saying, what's the motivation here? What's the motivation of this platform, of this outlet? And their motivation is to keep your attention, to keep your eyeballs, to deliver you to marketers. So, it doesn't play well to say things are going really well. Back to you in the studio, John. I mean, that doesn't work. If we can look at these things through a critical eye and say, okay, yeah, it is the 24-year-old that's probably holding a Slurpee while he's typing it or whatever.
For sure.
But realize what the motivation is.
Maybe watching porn. While he's typing in the breaking headline to get you geared up at 7 a.m. in the morning, he's looking at porn. Who knows what else he's looking at, So he's doing Tinder and porn at the same time, typing your lower third in to get you geared up at 7 a.m. in the morning. Quite possible.
Quite possible. I hope for the sake of his job that he's not sexting at the same time. He's got to type breaking news correctly.
The book, Numb, How the Information Age Dulls Our Senses and How We Can Get Them Back. Charles, where would you like to send people? The books are all available at all the fun places books are available. What website would you like to direct people to?
The publisher's Wiley. Folks can buy the book anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle. It's available at all the different outlets. Audiobooks will be available later this summer.
Cool. Do you have a website you want to send people to for you?
Yeah, charleschaffin.com.
Cool.
It's the website.
Charles, thank you very much. Keep me posted on the next book. Is this your first book?
I've done a couple of books for my organization. This is my first consumer book on my own. Yeah.
Well, keep me posted on the next one. There's always, as I tell every author I talk to, I have actually written books for Wiley too, but every time there's got to be a number 2 is my point.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.